How's it going, friends, and welcome back to the channel. In this video I paint a camo net, destroy a perfectly good paintbrush, I'm regretting getting upgrade tracks for this kit. So let's have a really quick look at this kit. Now this is a 1956 kit from Tamiya and it's quite supposedly well detailed. I know it's a simple little brain carrier, but I will have to say is that the detail is nice and crisp, and you know there's no real need for any sort of upgrades on this, though I do later on add some resin track upgrades because I thought that might lift the model a little bit, but in general cracking detail. It does come with a few figures as well, and most of the time I tend to find Tamiya figures, particularly kit ones, are a little bit soft, but to be fair these ones are actually I think quite decent and very usable, so I don't think you'd really need to get any replacement figures or anything for this. I won't actually be using any figures within the kit, but they may be useful for something else later on down the road. The kit also comes with some nice decals. It also comes with a little bit of string to use as a towing rope, and these good old-fashioned vinyl tracks, which are also, as always, very horrible. The construction of the kit is a very simple one. I mean, after all, it is a brain carrier. But I have decided to build this in a fairly sort of modular fashion. The reason for this is because I want to be able to paint the interior with ease rather than sticking all together and attempting to paint it, and then obviously do the exterior separate later on. I decided to modify the gear stick. There was no real reason for this. I just wanted to make it look a little bit more realistic, so I cut it from the box and the knob and just put a copper bit of wire in there just to make it look a bit more realistic, because obviously that was quite a chunky stick in there. There was no real reason or need to do this. It was just something I fancied doing. I was going to try and do a few more scratch build upgrade type things in the middle of this, but to be honest with you, there was no real need to. And again, like I said, the brain carrier is a simple little thing and there's not really much that needs to go into it. Now there are a couple of ejector pin markers that need to be removed. There's two at the front and one at the back. Everything on the lower half of the hull, apart from the one at the front, they need to be removed. Fortunately they are raised, so I just used my chisel to remove those, and a little bit of sanding just to smooth it all out. While I was doing my sanding and chiseling, I decided to remove the wires for the lights at the front of the vehicle. Again, this is something that didn't really need to be done, but I did, and I used some lead wire for this. It's mainly for that main front headlight there, because it just sort of went somewhere rather actually into the bottom. But again, this is something that doesn't need to be done, and in fact later on you don't see this at all. At this point I did a little bit of a dry fit. Again, perfect fit, everything went together really nicely. You can see that's why I haven't done much of a build up with this video, because it's all, you know, straightforward. There is a little bit sparse on the inside. It does come with a few bits and pieces to go in there, but I've got a load of spares kicking around, so I thought I'd busy up the inside and make it a little bit more interesting. The paint job itself, again, very simple and easy. It was this sort of like dark British green sort of colour, which I had to sort of mix up myself, and then just painting all the little details that need to be shown, like the exhaust extinguishers, and also obviously, as you've seen, I've done a little bit of chipping. Most of this was sponge chipping, and then just a little bit of tidying up and accentuating some of these chips by using a brush. And then it was moving on to a wash, and as always my trusty Tamiya panel accent line for this, I just find this is pretty much useful for pretty much everything, and as always using some white spirits just to clean it all up and tidying everything. Again, this is the reason why I decided to do it in this sort of modular fashion, just to make this stage a lot easier, because I think I'd find this very difficult later on to try and paint when it was all fitted together. You also may just be able to see around the radio I added a couple of wires, again using lead wire for this because it's a lot more flexible and easier to put into some, you know, very tight sort of bends and in, again, tight spaces. The exterior got painted in the dark British green that I made up earlier, and then with some AK masking putty I obviously marked out the camo lines that I want to be adding onto the vehicle. Now this camo putty is okay, it's not too bad, it's like a sort of like a vinyl sort of material, and to be honest with you, I just buy or get some poster tack or buy blue tack or something like that. It's cheaper and is just as effective and also reusable. And the also thing I find with the masking putty is after a while it starts to spread. Especially if you put a lot of the stuff on, it gets kind of heavy and then sort of self levels and then just slides off the model if you're not careful. For the black camo, I have used Tamiya's NATO black and a little drop of Tamiya flat black. I tend to find that this is the best sort of concoction, if you like, for black, because nothing ever really is, you know, black. So I did that, and I did go over it a little bit with a little bit of buff just to sort of do a little colour modulation on it. This was all painted with my new Gallery 98D airbrush. It's a really nice airbrush, actually. It's really, you know, does a really nice job, as you can see here. If you are interested in the airbrush, if you go in the links down below, that will take you to their website, and if you use my affiliate link below, that will also help the channel out. And also, if you do decide to buy one of their airbrushes, and if you use the code SullyScale010 at checkout, that will give you an extra 10% off your order. They also they also ship even to the UK and in Europe. So if you are interested, you know, you'll be helping us out, and also you'll get yourself a nice little discount. So with that shameless plug out of the way, we move on to the tracks. Now these are FC Model Trends resin upgrades, and I kind of wish I hadn't bothered. Now they're okay, the detail's not too bad on them, but they just don't really fit. They're too long, as you can see at the start of this little segment. I had to remove the locating points for the original tracks, and later on when I offered it up to the model, I had to reposition everything. So yeah, they're okay. I did actually also have to shorten the top length of the track as well, just to make sure that they fitted on properly. They don't really align very well at the front end. Well, they do, but the way I had to sort of manipulate it to sort of fit, it didn't look great. But fortunately, because it's got a front fender on this, you don't notice it, so you can sort of at least make a little bit of a bodge up at one end. Now if you haven't used resin upgrades before, they're very simple in general to clean up. As you can see, just using a knife and some sprue cutters, that will remove all the little supporting arms. I would suggest, just in case, cleaning them with some warm soapy water beforehand, just in case there's any residue. And I did wear some gloves because when I was messing with them, I felt my sort of fingers starting to get a little bit itchy. So yeah, just as a precaution, I'd do that, give them a good wash, and you know, you should be good. So for the time being, I'm going to put those tracks aside, and I'm going to work on the camo net. And for this part, just to protect the model and make things a little bit easier in the long run, sort of, I've put some cling film over the model. So the reason being is because I've got this sort of meshing that I've got from somewhere to use as a camo net. As you can see, I've dipped it in some Mod Podge there and sort of spread it out on a towel just to wick away most of the glue, and then just put into place over the model. And this is where it comes in handy, putting some cling film or something similar over the model so you can position it, the glue can dry, and it's not going to mess up your previous paint job. Once it was dry, I was then also able to paint it in situ. Now I eventually did actually remove it from the model and hand paint some of it, because I didn't get a very good coverage, and also I think when I pulled it off the model, it separated and exposed a bit more of the original colour of the camo net. Also wasn't actually happy with the colour that I used at this point, so again, in sort of a general, it got a bit of a repaint. Right, so we can move back on to these tracks. Now I had a bit of a disaster, as you can see here. One of the issues with resin, and particularly with these sort of things, because they are, you know, they're not chunky bits of resins, they are quite delicate. And when I was moving some stuff around on the bench, they fell, hit the floor, and the disaster just ensued from that. Fortunately, there was enough parts left that I could find and be able to sort of stick them all back into place later on and kind of make it look like it should be. What I actually did later on was able to hide all this with some weathering, so all that was kind of quite pointless really. So once that disaster was out of the way, I moved on to some weathering. Now what I've done for this was a little bit different, and what I wanted to try and do is sort of create these sort of like rain streaks. Now what I've done is, I for once actually haven't varnished the model at all, and all I've done is put a load of water over the model and use this sort of deck tan buff mixture, and then again, as you've seen, just slap it all over the model, and then with a dry-ish brush streak it all down to give again the impression of rain streaks. Most of the areas, particularly on the front sort of glacier plate, if that's I think what it's still called on a brain carrier, I just sort of generally left it in the areas and let it accumulate again, just to simulate sort of like, you know, dusty rain sort of conditions. Once that was dry, I moved on to muddying up the lower half of the hull. Now originally I used AK's terrain paste for this, and I wasn't overly happy with it. There's a little bit of sort of like grit in there, but it's very sparse and wasn't really, you know, muddy enough. So after I gave it this sort of blending coat and realised that I was not happy with it, I come back in with some baby powder. It sounds a bit weird, but yeah, just turns out mixing that with a little bit of water or a little bit of paint clumps the stuff up and works really well as, you know, clumpy mud. Once I jammed it in every corner possible that I thought looked appropriate, I again gave it another blending coat, and I actually did a little bit of a darker coat just to emulate sort of like wet mud, and you know, because if you've got thick mud, chunks of it will take a little bit longer to dry out. So I went back in with yet again my favourite panel liner, Tamiya dark brown, and just put it into the areas that I thought again would be wetter. And what I did with some white spirits later on was just blend it in just to make it look a little bit less harsh. So then it was time to move on to the base. Now I've just used some good old modelling foam for this and some thick plastic card for the borders of the base. What I've done earlier on is place the model in the centre of this base and just sort of positioned it around to somewhere where I was happy, and I wanted to kind of put it into this kind of like slight gradient just for a little bit of a different sort of composure. As you can see, what I've done is I've used that same paste that I used earlier on to give you just a main covering of the ground. Again, mostly it's not really going to be seen, but just to help me along a little bit. I then started adding tufts of grass. Now what I've done for this is I used an old paintbrush, which I don't think we need to use anymore. Maybe, I'm not sure. We'll find out when we need to paint the fences again, I think. But yeah, so these were just literally, you know, just cut from the brush into some sort of rough lengths. I've kept them kind of roughly about the same-ish length, just again keep it vaguely, you know, you don't want it completely uniform, but keep them all at a rough, you know, sort of similar height. Across the front of the base, I've made sure that they're quite close together, just to give the impression that it's thick grass and not just little tufts of the stuff. As you can see there, I've also used some woodland scenics there for a bush, just to add a little bit more of difference in the diorama, but also I was running out of the brush. As you can see, there's some bits of black brush there from another brush I definitely know we don't need anymore, and I've sort of laid them flat just to give the impression that the brain has gone through this sort of field and flattened this bit of grass that it's gone over. To unify the base, I've used Mr. Surfacer Mahogany. This is mainly because it's the only primer I've got, but actually using a brown paint as a base coat I find to be the best way to do this, because it gives a kind of a bit more of a natural sort of looking shadow, and also if you do miss some bits, it kind of looks a little bit like dead grass. For the main base colour of the green, I've used Tamiya's XF5 flat green for this, and added mixes of yellow and black. I kind of went a little bit all over the place with this. At this point, I think this is probably kind of like the right sort of colour green for grass. Maybe a little bit, probably should have been a little bit brighter. But when I placed the Bren onto the model, I found it just stuck out like a sore thumb. It just didn't look right. So I darkened the grass a little bit more. Probably a bit unnatural, but I feel like when it all comes together, it looks a little bit better. I also added this little bush thing that I got lying around from AK. Again, added a little bit of height to the model and a little bit of colour. As you can see as well, with making sure those grass tufts were relatively close together across the front, makes them look like a solid wall of grass. I did also add a little bit of buff just to give it a little bit of a highlighting as well, just again try and get a little bit of variation. And as you can see now, sticking the Bren on, it kind of blends in a little bit better. If I used the previous colour, it just looked honestly awful. So the last thing I wanted to do was add a little bit more to the bush at the front, and what I've used is some good old school flocking, which is that sort of sawdusty type sort of stuff. Stuck it into a bowl, used some coloured paint, which I'm not quite sure what I used. It was quite a bit of a mixed mash. Mushed it all together, put it onto a towel to dry out, and then all I did after that was just sprinkle it over the bush, and then all I had to do was paint the base black, and that was it. So there we go, friends, that's it for this build. Nice, relatively simple and easy project, and a nice little subject to play around with. These sort of things, I think they've got quite a bit of potential for, you know, having a bit of a play around for these sort of things and adding all sorts of little bits and making a nice little diorama out of. All that's left for me to say now is thank you ever so much for watching the video. I do hope you have enjoyed it. If you have and you're new around here, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I also want to say a massive thank you to channel members Barney Mins and John Alex Scale Modelling for supporting. If you'd also like to help support the channel, there are links in the description down below. And also don't forget, if you're interested in the Galley airbrush, don't forget Sully Scale 010 for a 10% discount on your purchase. So again guys, thanks ever so much for watching. Again, I hope you have enjoyed, and I'll catch you again soon.